Age Wonder here, and welcome to my van down by the river. So welcome to part 2 of the story of the time I did battle with a witch. Actually, it was multiple covens of witches that I did battle with. And in part 1, you heard how a family member twisted off into witchcraft and drug abuse, had become a child abuser and a neglecter of her own children, and was trying to convince the state of Texas to let her have her kids back, even though she was still hooked on meth. And was actually meth and pot were being sold through her home in New Mexico. I came to find out during the course of this investigation into what was really happening to these poor children. Because these kids are grown now and have kids of their own, the children in question, I will not go into the darker details of the things that happened to them. Let's just say bad things happened to them. I can't talk about it. I shouldn't talk about it. I almost feel bad telling the story because I know these kids are out there. And if you're out there, I want you to know that through all of this, your grandmother and I had only the best intentions for you. And we worked very hard and did what we could to protect you. And it was always just from a position of love through all of this. And the tragedy that they've gone through in the telling of this story, that those kids, it breaks my heart. And I'm so glad to see them all doing well. Well, at least the kids that I know about, and I guess the other ones seem to be doing well too, as they all approach adulthood now and start to have kids of their own. So once the Buke and the Rebuke happened and she fled to New Mexico, we did not hear from her for a good while. And I won't get into much more of this custody battle. Let's just say at one point, June was the most wanted person in the county. That before it was over, she would be named number 1 in the county's most wanted list because of her second time that she came back. She kidnapped the children on a visit. She was allowed to visit, and she literally kidnapped the children, took them to the movies, and never came back, sort of thing. And so, time passed where she didn't have the kids, and things just got worse for her. She got deeper into drugs. Apparently she got deeper into witchcraft. And none of us heard from her for a very long time. Until my mother showed up at my house. Honestly, I hadn't thought about June in a good while. Her kids were doing well. They were in school. They were adjusting. I know that they thought about her, and I'm sure that my mother, who's a prayer warrior for our family, never stopped praying for June. And my mother was always her greatest advocate, was always defending June. And, it's because my mom's a person of mercy, especially when it comes to the members of our family, especially female members of our family. And she's always going to be your best advocate. And so she just disappears until I get a phone call from my mother. And by this time, I have joined the Devil Fighting Church. Years have passed now. We're talking, this is 3 years later. 3 years later. I'd been involved in this church for right at 2 or 3 years. It was 2 or 3 years later. I'd been ordained by them. I'd been trained by them. I'd already built my youth group. I was a regional youth director. I was an expert in exorcism and deliverance ministry, and it was a big part of what I did. And one of the reasons, well, I won't even get into all that. I will just say that I wasn't scared of no devils no more, and I knew a little bit more to do than just rebuke them. And I'll just quote a line from my song, Texas Exorcist. If you haven't listened to the song Texas Exorcist, I urge you now to go when you're done, or even stop the video now and find my music video, me with a banjo and a hat on, called Texas Exorcist, because it's a bit of an autobiographical story. But by this time I had fully become the Texas Exorcist, and to quote a line from that song, I was the kind of person that made demons tremble when I walked past. They hoped that I didn't see them. They would hide in hope that I wouldn't know that they were there, because they knew I was unafraid to wade right in and cast them out. That they better not even talk to me. That I had gone from being weak, I had undergone a spiritual transformation in those 3 years. I was finally as strong spiritually as I was physically at the time. You also know I'm a martial artist and a gun guy. So at that point in my life, I was unafraid of man or demon, that nothing scared me anymore. I knew who I was in Christ, and I knew who I was physically, and I was unafraid of anything. So I was a different guy, but I was also extremely busy. You don't understand, probably from listening, you may not have picked up, if you're a listener of my channel or viewer of my channel, that I was working 80 to 100 hours a week. That being the Tri-State Regional Youth Director took up every moment of every day. I was either working or I was laid out on my own couch, so exhausted I couldn't pick my head up. And it is part of what led to the end of my marriage and the issues there with my own family, because I wasn't able to be present at home because I was giving too much at church, too much at work. But so my mother calls me and says, "Hey, I've got June down here in a hotel room. She's hit rock bottom. She weighs 90 pounds. She's slit her wrist 2 or 3 times. I couldn't stop her. I'm afraid to take her to the hospital, because if I do, they're going to put her in the mental ward again. And this is where I find out that this is what's been going on with her, that she had become mentally unstable. The addiction was eating her alive, and now she was so demonized that she was attempting suicide and cutting herself. And I really didn't know. My mom tried to explain how bad it was in coaxing me to come. Now, my mom's a prayer warrior. If my mom can't deal with the demon like that, then it's bad. The demonization is deep and many when a woman like my mother, who's a prayer warrior, feels completely inadequate to deal with it and calls me in for, reinforcement to help. And she's like, "You have to come and do this." Now, here's the thing about deliverance churches that I don't like. Many of them will not do deliverance or exorcisms on people unless they're in the church themselves. They have to come to church. They have to somehow clean up enough to come and sit through a church service. And some people get so demonized that they can't, it's like Tourette's. They can't sit there without screaming obscenities at everyone that walks by and throwing things. That it can get so bad. Okay, so here's what happens. One demon can be quite clever inside of a human being. A person possessed by one demon can be really hard to tell that there's anything going on with them at all. But when they engage in witchcraft, when they engage in satanic rituals, and they invite these demons into their spirit, okay, that there can be so many of them that it's like an angry mob inside of a human being. Are you following me? Imagine an Antifa rally, except all the people in the Antifa rally are inside one human being trying to control their body. Okay? So when I arrived on the scene, and I went to the hotel room where my mom was at with this girl and to see what was going on, she was so demonized she couldn't make a sentence. Like, she couldn't speak. It was gibberish. It was a combination of weird aliens speaking in tongues and obscenities and a lot of crying. And she had cut marks all up and down her arm where she'd been cutting herself. and this happened, it was starting to heal. My mom's main objective was to keep her from killing herself. But her demons would fight with each other, and she went back and forth between them, yelling back and forth at herself, really, in commentary and narrative about what was going on in the room at the moment. I tried to ignore her and just talk to my mother. But let me tell you, it was a mind-numbing thing to see. It was quite frightening, and it gave me an insight into demonization that I'd never seen before. I'd never seen a legions. This was a genuine, bona fide legions. She had become so demonized that they couldn't agree with whether they were going to try and kill her or whether they were going to try to use her to do something awful, that there were so many of them that they were fighting for control, that she was a convulsing, convoluted, delusional mess who could not even look you in the eye and communicate, and was really this dialogue between, it had to have been dozens of personalities, hundreds, ranging different levels of, I don't know. It was, I'm beyond words to express to you how messed up this person was. I had never seen anything like this, even portrayed in a movie. How's that? That this was really beyond my own imagination, that my own ability to imagine what was going on here. She was that demonized. And so there was no time, there was no way she was going to sit through a church service. You know, it was just like constant watch to keep her from killing herself. She'd already been in and out of a couple of mental institutes, which really failed to diagnose her problem, because when they would put her in there, you know, I guess the head demon would straighten up and they would hide from them, and they would say she wasn't mentally ill, that she just had some emotional issues, and that she wasn't a danger to society, and they'd just turn her back out again. That she'd gone in and out like that for 72-hour periods 3 or 4 different times in that 3-year period since I'd heard from her. And so, at any rate, I go back to my bishop and I tell him what's going on, that there's this horribly demonized person that absolutely needs deliverance, and that we need to go help her. And he tells me what I know is already true, which is the church policy. We only do deliverance on church members who submit to authority, come to church, and are trying to straighten out, that we don't do this just on general people who are demonized. I totally disagreed with that, but I'm a man of submission to authority. When I submit to authority, it's, you know, I submit to it, whether I agree or not. But this was family, so it was different for me. So the person just above me in rank, but almost exactly beside me, one of those 7 men that I mentioned in my How I Became a Catholic Priest story. The man I've mentioned before when I said the first thing I did was walk in and say to the person at the desk, you know, hello, at the new church, at the devil fighting church. That person that I said would be a good friend, and her husband would become my best friend. This is who I'm talking about. And I went to him, my best friend and co-worker, pastor of a neighboring town church in our organization. And I said, brother, I'm asking you to do something a little out of authority, but I know that you and I have the spiritual authority to do this as 2 ordained ministers. We can go and do this, and we can deal with this demonized person and do it outside of the church. But we could get in trouble. I know we're not supposed to do this, but I think we should do it anyway, because this person needs us, and I disagree. So we're not doing this as church. We're just, you know what? You're my friend. I'm going to go cast the devils out of my family member, and I'm asking you to go with me. And he thought about it and contemplated it for a minute, and he decided that it wasn't proper, but it was doable. So we go to the hotel room together. We get our collars on, we've got our crosses, we got our anointing oil, we have our Bibles, our prayer books, and we go in and we have a deliverance book, which is a map on how to do this. And I won't get into the details of this process, but I will say, when that moment came and those devils had to leave, that it was like the sound of a bunch of different car horns being sounded at the same time. That this literally made a sound. When all of these demons left this woman, she opened her mouth and screamed. And when this sound came out, it was like nothing I have ever heard before. It was a sound of many car horns mixed with the sound of animals screaming in pain. That it was worse than any death cry I'd ever heard from an animal. I'm from the woods. I've heard some things at night. And this was worse than that. This was worse than, it was a bone-chilling sound that did not seem like it could come from a human being's vocal cords. And she opened her mouth, and this scream came out as those demons left. And you're going to think I'm crazy, but I'm going to tell you, and it must have been in the spirit, but it seemed very real to me, that when I followed that sound up to the ceiling, that I could see coming from her mouth these black shadows, almost like a flow of insects or some kind of black firefly, with, instead of fire, it was blackness. And it was just this, I can't explain it. It was what you would think 1,000 demons coming out of somebody would look like. And the ceiling of that hotel room opened up as those things went up into the sky. Like a fountain of blackness straight up into the night. It's the single strangest thing I've ever experienced, was that exorcism. When that happened and that scream let out, at that critical moment when we demanded that they all leave right then, and they did, she passed out and slept for 3 days. When she woke up, she didn't know how she got there. She didn't know what she was doing in a hotel room with my mother, or how she got there. She couldn't remember the past. About 60 days was a complete blank for her. And honestly, she seemed like the little girl that I knew before all of that, except she was very exhausted. She was very worn out. And it was like she was unaware any of that had happened. And then she began to share with me her life as a witch, and come clean and confess all the things that she had done. And honestly, you might think that this is the most interesting part of the story. And this is the end of part 2. If you want to hear the rest of the story, you will have to wait for part 3, which will be coming next, as I release this story in 3 parts. The finale coming at the end of, when I upload this, I'll come back. It should take about an hour, and I will have part 3 for you. All right. God bless.